Every year, people vanish under circumstances that leave behind more questions than answers. In some cases, there are witnesses, surveillance footage, and extensive searches, yet the person is never found. Files remain open, evidence disappears, and timelines refuse to make sense. Decades later, investigators still revisit these cases, hoping for clarity. In this video, we'll break down 5 unexplained disappearances that continue to puzzle investigators. The disappearance of Frederick Valentich, 1978. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old Australian pilot named Frederick Valentich departed from Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne for what was expected to be a routine training flight. Valentich was flying a rented Cessna 182L, a small single-engine aircraft commonly used for private aviation. His flight plan was simple. He intended to travel approximately 125 miles south across the Bass Strait to King Island, where he planned to pick up a small shipment of crayfish before returning to Moorabbin later that night. Valentich had logged around 150 hours of flight time and held a private pilot license, although his training record was considered average. According to instructors who had worked with him, he was enthusiastic about aviation but had previously struggled with navigation and had failed several commercial pilot examinations. Despite these concerns, the weather conditions that evening were considered good for flying, with clear visibility and only light winds across the strait. Valentich took off shortly after 6 p.m. local time and began the journey south along the coastline. For roughly an hour, the flight proceeded without incident. At 7:06 p.m., however, Valentich made an unexpected radio call to Melbourne Air Traffic Control. His voice sounded calm but uncertain. He asked the controller if there were any known aircraft flying below 5,000 feet in his area. The controller checked the radar and replied that no other aircraft were known to be nearby. Valentich then reported that he could see what appeared to be a large aircraft approaching him from the east. According to the official radio transcript, Valentich described the object as having 4 bright lights and moving at high speed. The controller asked him to confirm whether the aircraft might simply be another commercial flight. Valentich responded that he was unable to identify it. Over the next several minutes, he continued providing descriptions while circling the object. His transmissions became increasingly unusual. Valentich reported that the aircraft was passing above him repeatedly, and that it appeared to be shiny with a metallic surface reflecting his lights. At one point, he told the controller that the object was not an aircraft. The air traffic controller asked him to confirm his altitude and direction of travel. Valentich replied that he was flying at 4,500 feet and attempting to maintain visual contact with the object. His voice remained controlled, but noticeably tense. A few moments later, Valentich reported that the object was now hovering above his plane. He said the engine of his Cessna had begun to run roughly. The final recorded words from Valentich were brief. He told the controller that the mysterious object was hovering and that his engine was rough idling. Immediately afterward, the radio transmission was replaced by a loud metallic scraping noise that lasted for approximately 17 seconds before abruptly cutting out. Contact with the aircraft was never re-established. When Valentich failed to arrive at King Island, authorities initiated a large search operation across the Bass Strait. Air Force planes, commercial aircraft, and surface vessels combed the area where his last transmission had originated. The search continued for several days and covered more than 1,000 square miles of ocean. Despite the extensive effort, no wreckage, oil slick, or floating debris from the Cessna was ever located. Investigators examined Valentich's background in detail. Friends and family described him as deeply interested in aviation and fascinated by unidentified aerial phenomena, although there was no evidence that he had fabricated the incident deliberately. His father later stated that Frederick had always been serious about flying and had no reason to disappear intentionally. The official investigation considered several possibilities. One theory suggested that Valentich may have become disoriented while flying over open water at night. The Bass Strait is known for producing visual illusions that can confuse pilots, particularly when the horizon becomes difficult to distinguish from the ocean below. Under those conditions, lights from fishing boats or distant aircraft can appear distorted or closer than they actually are. Another possibility examined by investigators involved mechanical failure. If Valentich's engine had malfunctioned, the aircraft could have descended rapidly into the sea. However, even in such cases, crashes typically leave some trace of wreckage or fuel on the water. None was ever found. Aviation experts also analyzed the recorded audio from the final transmission. The metallic scraping sound heard during the last seconds has never been conclusively identified. Some investigators believe it may have been caused by interference from the aircraft's microphone or a problem with the radio equipment. Others have suggested it could have been the sound of the engine failing under stress. In 1982, a coroner reviewed the evidence but ultimately delivered an open finding. Without wreckage, witnesses, or physical proof of what occurred in the final moments of the flight, the cause of Valentich's disappearance could not be determined. More than 4 decades later, the case remains unresolved. The Bass Strait still holds no confirmed trace of the aircraft or its pilot. The final radio transmission, preserved in official records, remains the last known evidence of what happened in the dark sky south of Australia that night. The Sodder Children, 1945. On the night of December 24, 1945, the Sodder family home sat quietly on a hillside in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The house belonged to George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who had built a stable life in the small Appalachian town. Together they had 10 children. That Christmas Eve, 9 of them were at home. The evening had been ordinary. The children opened a few gifts, played with new toys, and gradually went to bed. By around 10 p.m., George and Jenny also went upstairs to sleep, leaving 5 of their children still awake downstairs. Those children were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, ranging in age from 5 to 14. At approximately 12:30 a.m., Jenny Sodder woke suddenly when the telephone rang. A woman's voice on the other end asked for someone Jenny did not recognize. She could hear laughter and clinking glasses in the background. When Jenny said there was no one there by that name, the caller apologized and hung up. As Jenny returned to bed, she noticed the house lights were still on and the curtains were open. She assumed the older children had forgotten to turn them off and closed the curtains before going back upstairs. Around 1 a.m., Jenny woke again, this time to the sound of something hitting the roof. She described it later as a loud thud followed by a rolling noise. She looked outside but saw nothing unusual. Roughly half an hour later, smoke began filling the house. The Sodders woke to the smell of fire spreading rapidly through the ground floor. George and Jenny rushed to gather the children sleeping upstairs. 4 of them were quickly brought outside into the cold December air. But 5 of the children who had been downstairs earlier were missing. Flames were already consuming the staircase and much of the lower level. George attempted to re-enter the house but was forced back by the heat and smoke. He tried to use the family's ladder to reach the upstairs window where the missing children might have gone for safety. The ladder, usually leaning against the house, was not there. George then tried to start his 2 coal trucks parked nearby, so he could drive them closer to the house and climb onto the roof. Both vehicles, which had been working the day before, failed to start. With the fire spreading quickly, the family had no way to reach the children believed to be trapped inside. A neighbor called the Fayetteville Fire Department, but the response was slow due to the town's limited emergency resources. By the time firefighters arrived several hours later, the Sodder house had burned completely to the ground. During the search of the ashes, investigators expected to recover the remains of the 5 missing children. Instead, they found almost nothing. According to the official report, no identifiable human remains were discovered in the debris. Local authorities concluded that the children had died in the fire and that the blaze had been caused by faulty wiring. The case was closed soon afterward. However, George and Jenny Sodder immediately questioned that conclusion. George argued that the electrical wiring in the house had recently been inspected and declared safe. More troubling was the absence of remains. Fire experts later told the family that even in intense house fires, bones and other fragments are usually found. The Sodders also began recalling several unusual events that had occurred in the weeks leading up to the fire. George had reportedly been visited by a man who tried to sell him life insurance. When George declined, the man allegedly warned him that his house would go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed. Another incident involved a stranger examining the house's fuse box and commenting that it could cause a fire. The Sodders had also noticed someone watching their property from the road. In the days following the fire, additional reports began to surface. A woman who ran a roadside motel in South Carolina claimed she had seen several children matching the Sodder children's descriptions the morning after the fire. She said they were traveling with 2 adults in a car with Florida license plates. Another witness in West Virginia claimed to have seen the children in a passing vehicle shortly after midnight, on the night of the fire. The Sodders hired a private investigator and continued searching for answers. In 1949, they financed an excavation of the house site, hoping to recover evidence overlooked in the original search. The excavation produced several small bone fragments that were sent for analysis. The results suggested the bones likely came from a person between 16 and 22 years old, older than any of the missing children. The discovery deepened the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Years later, in 1967, Jenny Sodder received a photograph in the mail. The image showed a young man in his 20s who bore a strong resemblance to her missing son Louis. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message that read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Elil boys, a 90132 or 35. There was no return address. The family attempted to trace the origin of the letter but found no leads. The photograph was later analyzed by experts who said the facial structure could match Louis as an adult, though the identification was not conclusive. George and Jenny Sodder never stopped searching for their children. In the 1950s, they placed a large billboard along a highway near Fayetteville, displaying photographs of the 5 missing children and offering a reward for information. The sign remained standing for years. Despite numerous tips and rumors, no verified evidence ever emerged showing what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder after the night their home burned. The official explanation remains that they perished in the fire. Yet the absence of remains, the strange events before the blaze, and the reported sightings afterward have left the case unresolved for nearly 8 decades. Today, the disappearance of the Sodder children remains one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in American history. The Lost Patrol of Lake Onjikuni. In the winter of 1930, reports began circulating about a remote Inuit settlement near Lake Onjikuni in northern Canada that appeared to have been suddenly abandoned. The story was first brought to attention by a trapper named Joe LaBelle, a man who had spent years traveling through the wilderness of what is now Nunavut. According to accounts later published in Canadian newspapers, LaBelle arrived at the small lakeside village after several days of traveling by dog sled through freezing conditions. The settlement was familiar to him. On previous journeys, he had stopped there to trade supplies and share meals with the local families. The village was known to consist of several dozen residents who lived in simple wooden cabins and seasonal shelters near the shore of the lake. When LaBelle approached the settlement that evening, something immediately felt unusual. The area was silent. No dogs barked, and no smoke rose from the chimneys despite the harsh winter temperatures. As he moved closer, LaBelle reportedly noticed that several kayaks and hunting tools were still stored near the cabins, as if their owners expected to return soon. He called out but received no response. Curious and concerned, he entered one of the cabins. Inside, he found cooking pots still hanging above a cold fire pit and food supplies that appeared untouched. Personal belongings remained scattered throughout the small structure. There were clothing items, hunting equipment, and bedding, but no sign of the people who had lived there. LaBelle continued checking other cabins and claimed to find similar scenes. Some reports later stated that meals appeared to have been left unfinished, though this detail was never confirmed in official records. What was clear from LaBelle's account was that the village seemed to have been left in a hurry, without the normal preparations that Inuit communities would typically make before traveling long distances during winter. Troubled by the discovery, LaBelle continued searching the surrounding area, but saw no tracks leading away from the settlement. According to the story that later circulated, the snow around the cabins appeared undisturbed. After spending several hours examining the site, he decided to report the situation to authorities. LaBelle traveled nearly 30 miles to the nearest telegraph station and sent a message to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Within days, an RCMP patrol was reportedly dispatched to investigate the abandoned village. The officers who arrived found the same quiet scene described by the trapper. Several cabins stood intact near the shoreline. Supplies remained inside, including ammunition, tools, and preserved food. The sled dogs that usually accompanied the residents were missing, but some reports claimed that a number of them were later discovered dead near the edge of the settlement, apparently from starvation. According to the accounts published at the time, the officers searched the area around Lake Onjikuni for signs of the missing residents. The search reportedly extended across several miles of frozen wilderness. Some newspaper reports even claimed that investigators discovered graves in a nearby burial ground that had been opened and left empty. However, these details later became one of the most disputed elements of the case. As the story spread through Canadian and American newspapers in the early 1930s, the disappearance was described as involving anywhere from 25 to more than 40 people. Headlines referred to it as the vanishing village of Lake Anjikuni. The idea that an entire community could disappear without leaving tracks or evidence quickly captured public attention. Yet as historians and researchers began examining the case decades later, they encountered a complicated problem. Official records from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police did not clearly support the dramatic version of events described in newspapers. Several RCMP documents indicated that officers had investigated the claims, but found no abandoned village matching the description. According to those records, the story may have been exaggerated or misreported by journalists who relied heavily on secondhand accounts. Some researchers suggested that LaBelle may have encountered a seasonal hunting camp that had simply been vacated by its residents before winter travel began. Inuit communities in the region often moved between camps depending on hunting conditions, and a settlement could appear deserted if its occupants had relocated. Other historians noted that many of the details reported in early newspaper stories changed over time, including the number of people supposedly missing and the condition of the cabins. Despite these contradictions, the original account never completely disappeared. The remote geography of Lake Anjikuni made it difficult to verify exactly what LaBelle may have seen in 1930. The area lies deep within the northern tundra, far from major towns or permanent infrastructure. During that period, communication between isolated communities and southern authorities was limited, and written documentation was often incomplete. Modern researchers who have studied Inuit history in the region point out that small settlements frequently formed and dissolved depending on hunting seasons, trade routes, and weather patterns. It is possible that the settlement LaBelle described was temporary and its residents had simply moved on. Yet the details that entered public memory continue to raise questions. If the village had merely relocated, why were reports describing abandoned belongings and empty cabins so persistent in early accounts? Why did the story reach the Royal Canadian Mounted Police if there was no unusual situation to investigate? And why did the narrative remain consistent enough to circulate for decades as one of the most puzzling disappearance stories in Canadian folklore? Nearly a century later, the events surrounding the so-called lost settlement of Lake Anjikuni remain uncertain. What Joe LaBelle actually encountered during his journey across the frozen lake in 1930 has never been fully confirmed. The official records suggest a misunderstanding or exaggeration, yet the original report of a silent, deserted village continues to leave an unanswered question about what truly happened in that remote corner of northern Canada. The Beaumont children, 1966. On the morning of January 26, 1966, a summer holiday in Australia, 3 siblings left their home in the Adelaide suburb of Somerton Park and walked toward the nearby beach at Glenelg. Their names were Jane Beaumont, age 9, Arna Beaumont, age 7, and Grant Beaumont, age 4. It was not unusual for the children to make the short trip alone. The neighborhood was quiet, and Glenelg Beach was a popular destination for local families. Their parents, Jim and Nancy Beaumont, had allowed the outing many times before. That morning, around 10 a.m., their mother gave them a small amount of money for lunch and instructed them to return home by early afternoon. Several witnesses later reported seeing the children at the beach shortly after they arrived. They were observed playing in the sand and swimming in the shallow water along the shore. A number of people also recalled seeing them in the company of a tall, thin, blond man, estimated to be in his late 20s or early 30s. According to witness descriptions, the man appeared relaxed and friendly with the children. At one point, he was seen helping them dress after swimming. Witnesses later said the children seemed comfortable around him, which led some investigators to believe he may have been someone they had met earlier that day. Around midday, Jane Beaumont visited a local bakery and purchased several meat pies and pastries. The shop assistant noticed something unusual during the transaction. Jane paid with a £1 note rather than the coins her mother had given her earlier. When the woman asked where the extra money had come from, Jane reportedly replied that it had been given to them by the man. The children then returned toward the beach area. Several other witnesses later told police they saw the three siblings walking along Jetty Road with the same unidentified man later that afternoon. The group appeared calm and unhurried. Some accounts suggested the man carried a bag or towel. None of the witnesses reported anything that seemed immediately suspicious. By 2 p.m., Nancy Beaumont began to expect her children home. When they failed to arrive, she initially assumed they had missed the bus or stayed longer at the beach than planned. However, as the afternoon passed with no sign of them, concern began to grow. By evening, Jim Beaumont returned from work and the couple began searching the neighborhood. When the children still had not returned by nightfall, the police were notified. Officers immediately began canvassing Glenelg Beach and surrounding streets. The search quickly expanded as investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses who had seen the children earlier in the day. The reports about the unidentified blonde man soon became a central focus of the investigation. Several witnesses described him as tall, athletic, and well-dressed, with light hair and a confident demeanor. One witness told police that the man had approached the children near the beach and begun talking to them as if he already knew them. Another reported seeing the group lying together on the sand in what appeared to be a relaxed conversation. Despite these sightings, the man was never identified. Police launched one of the largest investigations in South Australian history. Hundreds of officers participated in searches across beaches, parks, abandoned buildings, and nearby farmland. Volunteers joined the effort, combing through dunes and drainage areas. The children's clothing, bags, and personal belongings were never found. Investigators examined possible suspects, including individuals known to frequent the Glenelg area. Over the years, several persons of interest were questioned, but none could be conclusively linked to the disappearance. One suspect who drew attention decades later was a wealthy businessman named Harry Phipps, who lived near the beach and had previously been associated with allegations involving children. Excavations were conducted at locations connected to Phipps in the early 2000s, including an abandoned factory site. Despite extensive digging, no evidence connected to the Beaumont children was recovered. Another significant lead emerged in 1967 when a woman reported seeing 3 children matching the Beaumont's descriptions, accompanied by a man at a small rural store more than 300 miles from Adelaide. According to the store owner, the man appeared nervous and the children remained quiet during the visit. Investigators traveled to the area but could not confirm the sighting. As the years passed, the disappearance of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont became one of the most enduring unsolved cases in Australian history. Their photographs were widely circulated across the country, and the case reshaped how Australian families viewed child safety. In the decades that followed, numerous tips, reported sightings, and confessions surfaced. Many were investigated thoroughly, but none produced definitive answers. The unidentified blonde man seen with the children that afternoon remains one of the most critical missing pieces of the investigation. Witness descriptions were consistent enough to suggest he was real, yet no name was ever attached to his identity. Today, more than half a century later, the fate of the Beaumont children remains unknown. No confirmed trace of them has ever been discovered, and the events that took place after they were last seen walking along the streets near Glenelg Beach on that warm January afternoon remain unexplained. The disappearance of Lars Mittank, 2014. In the summer of 2014, a 28-year-old German man named Lars Mittank traveled to Bulgaria with a group of friends for a short vacation on the Black Sea coast. Mittank was from the city of Marne in northern Germany, where he worked at a power plant. Friends described him as quiet, responsible, and close to his family, particularly his mother, Sandra Mittank. The group arrived in the resort town of Golden Sands near Varna in early July. For several days, the trip followed a typical pattern of beach outings, nightlife, and sightseeing. Nothing unusual was reported during the first part of the vacation. On the evening of July 6th, however, an incident occurred that would later become a key detail in the case. According to Mittank's friends, he became involved in an argument with several men at a local bar over a disagreement about soccer teams. The confrontation escalated into a physical altercation in a nearby alley. Mittank was reportedly struck during the fight and sustained an injury to his ear. Afterward, he complained of pain and dizziness. The next day, he visited a local doctor in Varna, who examined the injury. The doctor reportedly diagnosed a ruptured eardrum and advised Mittank not to fly until the pressure in his ear had stabilized. As a result, Mitank decided to remain in Bulgaria while his friends returned to Germany as scheduled. They helped him arrange a room at a small hotel called the Hotel Color in Varna and planned for him to fly home a few days later, once his condition improved. Over the next 2 days, Mitank remained in regular contact with his mother, by phone and text messages. At first, his messages sounded normal. However, his tone soon began to change. Mitank told his mother he believed the men involved in the bar fight were following him and might be connected to dangerous individuals. At one point, he wrote that he felt unsafe and that someone was trying to harm him. His mother attempted to reassure him from Germany and encouraged him to stay calm until he could return home. Hotel staff later reported that Mitank appeared increasingly nervous during his stay. According to one employee, he spent long periods standing near the hotel entrance, as if watching the street. On one occasion, he asked the front desk clerk if anyone had been asking about him. The employee told investigators that Mitank seemed frightened, but did not explain why. On July 8th, Mitank contacted his mother again and said he believed the people who had attacked him were trying to locate him at the hotel. He reportedly whispered during parts of the conversation and told her he did not feel safe staying there. Despite his anxiety, he also said he planned to go to Varna Airport the next day to catch his flight back to Germany. On the morning of July 9th, Mitank took a taxi from the hotel to Varna Airport. Security cameras captured his arrival at the terminal, carrying a small backpack and a suitcase. According to airport records, he entered the building and visited the airport medical office to obtain a medical certificate confirming he was fit to fly despite the earlier ear injury. Inside the clinic, he spoke briefly with a doctor while waiting for paperwork. Surveillance footage from the hallway shows Mitank behaving normally at first. However, a few minutes later, something appeared to change. According to the doctor's later statement, a construction worker entered the office area to complete maintenance work. At that moment, Mitank suddenly stood up and appeared alarmed. Without explanation, he rushed out of the medical office and into the airport terminal. Security cameras recorded the sequence clearly. Mitank dropped his suitcase and began running toward the exit doors. He moved quickly through the terminal, past several startled passengers, and ran outside toward the airport parking lot. The footage shows him sprinting across the roadway and climbing over a chain-link fence surrounding the airport perimeter. After reaching the other side, he ran into a nearby field covered with tall grass and sparse trees. That was the last confirmed sighting of Lars Mitank. Airport security initially assumed the man had left the property voluntarily. However, when the abandoned suitcase was examined, authorities discovered Mitank's passport, wallet, phone charger, and personal documents inside. His mobile phone was also left behind. The discovery raised immediate concern because it meant he had fled the airport without identification or money. Bulgarian police began searching the surrounding area later that day. The field beyond the airport fence led to wooded terrain and rural farmland outside Varna. Officers conducted ground searches and used tracking dogs, but no trace of Mitank was located. Over the following weeks, investigators reviewed airport surveillance footage, interviewed taxi drivers, hotel staff, and construction workers, and retraced Mitank's final movements. None of the witnesses reported seeing anyone chasing or threatening him at the airport. The construction worker who entered the clinic said he had never seen Mitank before and did not speak to him. Police also investigated the earlier bar fight in Golden Sands. Several men who had been involved were identified and questioned. According to investigators, none had any connection to organized crime or any reason to pursue Mitank after the incident. In Germany, Mitank's family continued searching for answers. His mother traveled to Bulgaria multiple times to distribute flyers and speak with investigators. The case attracted widespread attention online after the airport surveillance footage was released publicly. The video showed the final moments before Mitank vanished into the open fields outside the airport perimeter. Numerous reported sightings were later submitted from across Europe, but none were confirmed. Years after the disappearance, the circumstances surrounding Lars Mitank's final actions remain unclear. Investigators have never determined what caused him to suddenly flee the airport or where he went after crossing the fence. Despite extensive searches and international attention, no confirmed trace of him has ever been found. Thank you for staying until the end, and as the screen fades to silence, it is worth remembering that time rarely erases a mystery completely. It only buries fragments deeper in shadow, where truth waits quietly beyond memory.